An old man is walking uphill, and he hasn't said a word in 3 days. Beside him, a boy carries a bundle of wood too heavy for his frame, and a knife hangs at the old man's belt that no one has explained. They left 2 servants at the base of the mountain with strict instructions. Stay here, we will come back to you. Both of them, that's the detail worth sitting with. Abraham tells his servants, we will worship and then we will come back to you. And he says it about a journey he believes will end with his son's death. Somewhere ahead, on a ridge he's never climbed, is a summit God only described as the mountain I will show you. No name, no landmark, just an ascent into the unknown, 1 foot after another, toward a place that doesn't exist yet in Abraham's understanding, except that it will. Centuries later, God will use those same words again, for a different man, on a different mountain, calling him toward the same unknown. That's not a coincidence buried in the text. It's a pattern, and once you see where it leads, you won't read a mountain in Scripture the same way again. To understand what's happening on that ridge, you have to understand what Abraham does not yet have. There is no law written on tablets, no temple, no priesthood, no sacrificial system, no nation called Israel. What Abraham has is a promise, made decades earlier, repeated more than once, each time growing sharper. A son, a land, a people descended from him as numerous as the stars. For most of his life, that promise looked like it might fail simply for lack of time. Sarah was well past the age of bearing children. The land was occupied by others. The promise, humanly speaking, made no sense. Then Isaac was born. By the time we reach this mountain, Isaac isn't a symbol. He's the proof. He's the one tangible thing that makes the promise feel real instead of theoretical, the evidence that God had kept his word after 25 years of waiting. This happens in a world without nations, as we'd recognize them, a landscape of scattered clans, walled Canaanite city-states, and family altars built wherever a man chose to worship. Abraham has no temple to travel to, because nothing like that exists yet. When he wants to meet with God, he builds an altar himself, wherever he happens to be standing. Worship, at this point in the story, is local, personal, untethered to any single sacred site. It's worth understanding, too, that Abraham isn't living in a world where mountains are religiously neutral ground. Across the ancient Near East, high places were widely regarded as the natural meeting point between the divine and human realms. The closer to the sky, the closer to the gods. Mesopotamian temple towers were built in imitation of sacred mountains for exactly this reason. Canaanite religion, which Abraham would have encountered throughout his travels, treated certain peaks and high places as the dwelling sites of its gods. This isn't a detail Genesis explains, because it didn't need to. Abraham's world already assumed that mountains were where the human and the divine came closest together. What makes what happens next unusual isn't the general idea of a sacred mountain. It's what God does with that idea. God doesn't tell Abraham to build another altar where he is. He tells him to travel, 3 days, toward a specific region, to a mountain God hasn't even named yet. One of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Not an altar of convenience, a summit chosen in advance, revealed only as Abraham gets closer. And on that mountain, God asks him to give back the one thing that made the promise visible. This is the moment the text finally opens. Genesis 22:2 records the instruction in words that are easy to read past. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Sit with that phrase, the mountain I will tell you of. Not a mountain with a name, not a mountain Abraham already knows. A destination that only becomes clear the closer he gets to it. Here's what's easy to miss. That same shape of instruction, go toward a mountain of God's choosing, not yet fully revealed, shows up again generations later, when an entire nation is told to travel toward the mountain of God at Horeb. Genesis doesn't use identical wording to Exodus, and it would be overstating the case to claim otherwise, but the pattern underneath the wording is the same. God does not point Abraham to a mountain that already carries meaning, the way the surrounding Canaanite religions assumed certain peaks simply were sacred by nature. He assigns meaning to a mountain by telling someone to go there. It wasn't a sacred site Abraham was traveling toward, it was about to become one. That changes what a holy mountain actually is in Scripture. It isn't holy because of its height or its geology or some ancient reputation shared with the religions around it. It becomes holy because God meets someone there. The mountain doesn't make the moment sacred, the moment makes the mountain sacred. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What, exactly, is Abraham walking toward? Genesis 22:4 says something easy to read in half a second and feel nothing. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. 3 days, not 3 verses of narrated time, 3 actual days, walking beside the son he believes he's about to lose, with nothing to do but keep moving. Here's the detail worth slowing down for. The text tells us almost nothing about that journey. No dialogue, no description of Abraham's inner state, just distance covered and time passing. And bracketing the entire scene, twice, is one small, quiet phrase. The two of them walked on together. It appears right before Isaac asks the question every reader dreads, "Where is the lamb?" And again right after Abraham answers him. The narrator places the same 6 words on both sides of the hardest exchange in the chapter, like a frame around it. Scripture usually moves fast. Genesis can compress a person's entire life into a single verse. But here, at the one moment it would be easiest to summarize, Abraham traveled to the mountain and prepared to sacrifice his son. The text refuses to rush. It slows down. It makes you walk the distance with them. Not a fast obedience. A 3-day obedience, carried the whole way. That detail alone tells you something about what this pattern is actually about. It was never only about arriving at the summit. The ascent itself, the part where nothing visibly happens, is where the story chooses to linger. Which means we haven't even reached the mountain yet, and the text has already told us where to look. When Isaac finally asks the question, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's answer becomes the hinge of the whole scene. God will provide for himself the lamb. The Hebrew behind provide is worth handling carefully. The verb is related to ra'ah, to see. Scholars differ on exactly how much weight to place on that connection in this particular sentence, so it's fair to hold it loosely rather than treat it as settled. But what isn't in dispute is what happens a few verses later. After the ram is caught in the thicket and the sacrifice is stopped, Abraham names the place, not the mountain of testing, not the place of near tragedy. He calls it Yahweh Yireh, the Lord will provide, or the Lord will see to it. Then the text does something unusual for Genesis. It adds a note about how the name is still being used, as it is said to this day, "On the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided." To this day. That's the narrator stepping outside the story to tell you this isn't finished. The name isn't just a memorial to what happened once. It's phrased like an expectation, as if provision on this mountain is something that keeps happening, not something that happened. Genesis 22 isn't just recording an event. It's planting a naming convention the rest of Scripture is going to pick back up, which raises the question the chapter itself never answers. Which mountain is this? Genesis never tells you where Moriah is. No coordinates, no nearby landmarks, nothing to pin it to a map. The next time the name appears anywhere in Scripture is centuries later, in 2 Chronicles 3:1, describing where Solomon builds the temple, on Mount Moriah. It's a real and meaningful biblical connection, worth noting clearly. But it's worth being honest about what kind of connection it is. Genesis doesn't make this identification. Chronicles does, 500 years after the fact. That doesn't make the link untrustworthy. It means we should hold it the way the text itself presents it, as a later canonical tradition tying 2 mountains together, not as something Abraham or the original audience of Genesis would have known. But if that identification is even roughly right, something remarkable follows. The mountain where a father offered his son and God provided instead becomes, generations later, the mountain where an entire nation's sacrificial system is centered. the same location, the same principle. Provision, repeated at scale. And it isn't the last mountain God is going to name this way. If this is the first time you've seen Genesis 22 laid out like this, that's exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to do. Take a passage you already know and show you the layer underneath it. If you'd like more of that, subscribing means you won't miss where this pattern goes next. Because Abraham's mountain isn't the last one called this way, and what happens on the next one is going to make Moriah look like the opening scene of something much bigger. Move the timeline forward roughly 400 years. The family has become a nation, enslaved, then delivered, now standing in a wilderness with no home, no king, and no law. And the first thing God does with this newly freed people is send them to a mountain. It's worth pausing on what this nation had just come from. Egypt, in this period, was one of the most powerful and religiously saturated civilizations in the ancient world, with its own mountains, temples, and gods built into the very architecture of Pharaoh's authority. The Israelites, leaving Egypt, weren't stepping into a spiritual vacuum. They were stepping out of one religious system, still carrying its assumptions with them, toward a mountain that would define an entirely different one. That contrast matters for what happens next, because the God who meets them at Sinai isn't simply the strongest God in a crowded field. He's establishing, through the very geography of the encounter, that this relationship runs on different terms altogether. Exodus 3 tells us this mountain already had a reputation before Israel ever arrived there. Moses is tending sheep near Horeb, the mountain of God, when a bush catches fire and doesn't burn out. That phrase, the mountain of God, is used before God has done anything on it yet in the narrative. It's simply called that, as though the label preceded the event. Whether that reflects an earlier, unrecorded tradition about the site, or is the narrator naming it proleptically for the reader's benefit, is genuinely debated among scholars. But either way, when the nation finally arrives at Sinai in Exodus 19, the text treats the encounter as the fulfillment of something already promised. God had told Moses, back at the bush, "When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." Compare that to Moriah. Abraham was told to go toward a mountain God would show him, unnamed, unrevealed, until he arrived. Moses is told, decades in advance, exactly which mountain and exactly what will happen there. The vagueness has narrowed into a promise with an address. And what happens when the nation gets there is unlike anything before it. Exodus 19 describes boundaries set around the base of the mountain that no one, not the people, not even their animals, is permitted to cross. Thunder, thick cloud, fire and smoke, like the smoke of a kiln. The mountain trembled greatly. This isn't an altar built wherever someone happens to be standing. This is a mountain so charged with holiness that touching it means death. Here's what's easy to miss in the drama of the scene. This is the same category of event as Moriah, dialed up to a scale a single family could never have prepared you for. On Moriah, God provided a substitute so a son's life wouldn't be required. At Sinai, God gives a law that will govern how an entire nation lives in relationship with Him. Different content, same underlying grammar. An unfamiliar mountain, chosen in advance, becoming the place where God defines the terms of the relationship. But there's a tension worth naming honestly. Sinai isn't gentle. The nation that receives the law here is a nation kept at a terrified distance from the very mountain where their covenant is being formed. Whatever meeting place means at Sinai, it does not yet mean intimacy. It means holiness enforced by distance, which is going to matter enormously later, because centuries after this, another writer is going to look back at exactly this mountain and describe what has changed. For now, though, the pattern has widened. 2 mountains, 2 generations, both unfamiliar before God assigned them meaning, both becoming the place where a relationship with God is either tested or defined. And the next mountain in this pattern doesn't belong to a patriarch or a nation. It belongs to one exhausted man running for his life. Centuries after Sinai, Israel has split into 2 kingdoms, and the northern kingdom is ruled by Ahab, a king whose marriage to the Phoenician princess Jezebel brings the worship of Baal directly into the royal court. This isn't a fringe practice, tolerated at the edges of national life. Under Jezebel's influence, prophets of the Lord are actively hunted, and Baal worship becomes something close to state religion. Into that environment steps Elijah, a prophet with no political power, no army, and apparently no fear. On Mount Carmel, a coastal mountain visible for miles and heavily associated in the surrounding culture with Baal's own storm and fertility power, Elijah proposes a public test: 2 altars, 2 sacrifices, no fire lit by human hands. Whichever God answers by fire is God. The location itself is part of the confrontation. Elijah isn't just picking a convenient hilltop, he's challenging Baal on ground the surrounding culture already associated with him. Baal's prophets cry out from morning until midday, nothing. Elijah, in front of everyone, has his own altar drenched in water, not once, but 3 times, until the trench around it is full, removing any possibility of a hidden spark. Then he prays a single sentence. Fire falls from the sky, consumes the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water in the trench. 1 Kings 18 tells us the people fall on their faces and cry out, "The Lord, He is God." It's the loudest, most public, most undeniable display of God's power anywhere in Elijah's story. And then, within a single chapter, Elijah is running for his life into the wilderness, sitting under a broom tree and asking God to let him die. That collapse is worth sitting with, because it's not a minor detail, it's the hinge the whole next scene depends on. The prophet, who just watched fire fall from an open sky, is, days later, hiding in a cave on Mount Horeb, the very mountain where the law was given generations earlier. Same mountain God appeared on before, same God. And then, 1 Kings 19 tells us, a great wind tears the mountains apart and shatters rocks. But the Lord was not in the wind. An earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. A fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound so quiet that older translations render it a still, small voice. Newer translations render it closer to a sound of thin silence. Scholars differ slightly on the best rendering, but the contrast the text is building doesn't depend on which translation you prefer. It depends on what's missing. Wind, earthquake, and fire are exactly the phenomena that marked Sinai the first time this mountain mattered. Elijah, of all people, would recognize that vocabulary, and this time, none of it is where God is. God is in what's easy to miss entirely, the near silence after the noise has passed. Why would the same mountain produce 2 such different encounters, for 2 men separated by centuries, both desperate for God to show up? One possible answer, and it's an interpretive suggestion rather than something the text states outright, is that Horeb was never only the mountain of fire and thunder. It was always capable of being the mountain of the quiet voice, too. Elijah simply needed the loud kind of God to fail him first, so he could recognize the other kind was still there. Loud on Carmel, silent on Horeb, same prophet, same God, nothing like the same encounter. Which means the pattern we're tracing isn't only about mountains being chosen, it's about God consistently refusing to be predictable on them, showing up in fire when a nation needs boundaries, and showing up in near silence when an exhausted man needs to be found rather than overwhelmed. There's a third strand worth noticing here too, one that runs quietly alongside the narrative mountains and into Israel's worship itself. The Psalms and the prophets speak of the mountain of the Lord's house, not just as a place that already exists, but as a place with a future. Isaiah and Micah, writing in nearly identical language, both describe a coming day when the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and all the nations shall flow to it. Psalm 48 calls Zion, beautiful in elevation, the joy of all the earth. None of this was fulfilled in the prophet's own lifetimes. It's promise language, a mountain still waiting to become everything it was described as being, which means that even while Israel possessed an actual, physical Temple Mount in Jerusalem, its own prophets kept pointing forward, insisting that the mountain they had wasn't yet the mountain they'd been promised. Hold that unfulfilled promise in mind. It's going to matter for where this pattern eventually lands. Move the timeline forward again, roughly 800 years past Elijah, into a very different world. Rome governs the land now. There is no king from David's line on any throne, and a rabbi from Nazareth begins gathering a following by teaching, healing, and, on several deliberate occasions, going up a mountain. Matthew's Gospel is particularly attentive to this. The Sermon on the Mount, arguably the most famous block of teaching in the entire New Testament, opens with a simple geographical note. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. Matthew doesn't explain why a mountain, specifically, rather than a plain or a synagogue. But readers familiar with the earlier mountain scenes in Israel's story would recognize the shape of what's happening: a teacher, ascending, delivering the terms of a new kind of life to people gathered below him. It's not an explicit citation of Sinai. Matthew never says, "This is the new Sinai," but the echo, teaching delivered from a mountain to a newly gathered people, is difficult to read as accidental, especially from a gospel writer who elsewhere goes out of his way to present Jesus in continuity with Moses. Later in the same gospel, in Matthew 17, Jesus takes 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, up a high mountain by themselves. And there, the text says, he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. 2 figures appear beside him, Moses and Elijah. The 2 men most closely associated with mountain encounters in the story we've been tracing, standing on either side of Jesus. Then a cloud, the same detail that marked God's presence at Sinai, overshadows them, and a voice speaks from it. "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Peter, in the moment, wants to build 3 shelters, one for each of the 3 figures, as though this were another Sinai, another law-giving to be memorialized in a structure. The text doesn't explain his impulse, but it doesn't need to. Peter is standing on a mountain, watching a glowing figure flanked by Moses and Elijah, hearing a voice from a cloud. Of course he reaches for the only category he has. He's seen this shape before, or heard about it his whole life. The Greek word used for transfigured is metamorpho, the root behind the English word metamorphosis. Its conservative sense is simply changed in form or changed in appearance. It's not a word that, by itself, unlocks some hidden meaning, but paired with the scene around it, cloud, voice, Moses, mountain, it's hard not to hear Sinai being deliberately echoed one more time, not repeated, answered. Because here is where the pattern sharpens into something new. At Sinai, the people were kept at a terrified distance from the glory on the mountain. Even Moses, later, could only see God's back and live. At the Transfiguration, 3 ordinary disciples are close enough to touch the glowing figure in front of them. The boundary lines that once meant death to cross are, in this scene, simply gone. That's not a minor variation on the pattern. That's the entire trajectory of Hebrews 12 compressed into a single mountaintop scene, decades before the letter to the Hebrews was ever written. The fearful mountain, and the mountain that can finally be approached, appearing almost side by side in the person standing between Moses and Elijah. And Matthew isn't finished. His gospel opened its teaching ministry on a mountain. It reaches its emotional center on a mountain, and it closes, in Matthew 28, on a mountain too, the resurrected Jesus meeting his remaining 11 disciples on the mountain to which Jesus had directed them, commissioning them to go and make disciples of all nations. 3 mountain scenes, positioned at 3 structural turning points of one gospel. It would be an overreach to claim Matthew is doing nothing else with these locations. Mountains in his gospel likely also carry simple narrative logic, privacy for teaching, elevation for addressing crowds. But the placement, at exactly the moments the story pivots, is difficult to read as pure coincidence. Luke's Gospel and the Book of Acts add one more mountain to the sequence. Jesus ascends into heaven, Acts 1 tells us, from the Mount of Olives, just outside Jerusalem, the same range where, centuries earlier and unrelated to this event, The prophet Zechariah had described the Lord's feet standing on the Mount of Olives on the day he returns to Jerusalem. Acts itself never cites Zechariah in this scene, so the connection between Jesus' departure and that older prophecy is a thematic observation readers have long made, rather than something Luke states outright. It should be held with that caution. But the two angels who appear right after the ascension tell the watching disciples that this Jesus will come in the same way as you saw him go, which is, at minimum, Luke's own text anchoring both the beginning and the end of Jesus' earthly absence to the same physical ridge outside the city. By now, the pattern has moved through 6 mountains and roughly 2,000 years of story. Moriah, Sinai, Carmel, and Horeb together, the mountain of teaching, the mountain of transfiguration, the mountain of ascension. Each one unfamiliar until God, or the Son of God, chose it. Each one becoming the place where something in the relationship between heaven and earth was tested, defined, or changed. There's one more mountain left, and it isn't in the Gospels at all. There's a verse most readers pass over without a second look, tucked inside Ezekiel's poetic lament over the king of Tyre. Ezekiel 28, verses 13 to 14, describes a garden, Eden, the garden of God, and then, almost as an aside, calls it something else, the holy mountain of God. That's easy to miss the first time through, because nothing about Genesis 1:3 explicitly calls Eden a mountain. But Ezekiel, writing centuries later and clearly drawing on the same tradition, describes it that way without explanation, as if this was simply understood. A river flows out of Eden and divides into 4, Genesis 2:10 tells us, the kind of thing rivers do when they're descending from higher ground. Ancient Near Eastern temple architecture often incorporated rivers, gardens, and elevation together as part of a shared symbolic vocabulary for a sacred meeting place. Scholars are divided on exactly how far to press that architectural parallel onto Eden itself, and that caution is worth keeping. But the pieces are there, a garden, a river descending from it, God walking with humanity inside it, and Ezekiel's own later description calling the whole scene a mountain outright. If that's right, even cautiously right, then the pattern we've been tracing didn't start with Abraham. It started before Genesis 22 even opens. The first meeting place between God and humanity may itself have been a mountain, and that meeting place was lost, which means the unfulfilled promise sitting inside Isaiah and Micah, that mountain of the Lord's house the prophets kept pointing toward but never saw completed in their own lifetimes, was never a new idea. It was a restoration language describing something the world had already lost once before. Now hold that next to something else. Centuries after Abraham, centuries after Sinai, the writer of Hebrews sits down to explain to a Jewish Christian audience exactly what has changed. He does it by naming 2 mountains directly against each other. You have not come, he writes, to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest. Sinai, described almost as a warning, a mountain so holy that touching it meant death. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Not a rejection of Sinai, a fulfillment, in this later New Testament reading, of what Sinai was always pointing toward. The terrifying mountain that had to be approached with fear becomes, in the language of Hebrews, a mountain that can finally be approached at all. Which means the pattern isn't just a repeated image running through Scripture, it's an argument. A garden mountain lost, a law mountain guarded by fire and death, a city mountain promised by the prophets but never fully realized, and finally, a mountain opened. Revelation ends the entire Bible exactly where Ezekiel's description of Eden began. John carried away in the Spirit to a great high mountain, shown the holy city Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. Lost on a mountain, guarded on a mountain, promised from a mountain, restored on a mountain. That's not 6 unrelated stories that happen to share a setting. That's a single sentence, spoken across 4,000 years of Scripture, with one word never changing: mountain. Every ascent in between, Abraham's, Moses's, Elijah's, the disciples, is a chapter inside that one unbroken sentence, moving toward the ending Ezekiel described before anyone had climbed a single one of them. An old man walking uphill with his son. A former shepherd standing in front of a bush that burns and doesn't burn out. A prophet, exhausted, listening for a voice quiet enough to miss. 3 disciples watching a familiar face turn suddenly unbearable to look at. A small group standing on a hillside, watching the sky long after there was anything left to see. Different centuries, different names. Different fears. Same mountain in every sense that matters. Not the geography, the pattern underneath it. Every time someone leaves the valley, the familiar, the explainable, the safe, and climbs toward a place that has no meaning yet, because the meaning hasn't arrived. It arrives when God does, not before. Lost in a garden that Ezekiel calls a mountain, guarded at Sinai by fire no one could survive touching, renamed by Abraham after provision on a mountain he didn't choose, promised by prophets who never lived to see it, echoed by Elijah, who expected fire and got silence instead, transfigured in front of 3 men who didn't know what they were looking at, named at the very end of the story as the mountain the whole Bible was walking toward the entire time. The mountain was never the point, it was the meeting place. And Scripture has been describing the same meeting in different centuries, using the only word big enough to hold it. There is something almost unbearable about a 3-day walk with no explanation. Abraham doesn't get a vision halfway there, reassuring him it will be fine. He doesn't get a sign. He gets distance, footstep after footstep, and a son beside him asking a question he can't fully answer. Most of us know that walk, even if we've never called it Moriah. It's the space between the moment life stops making sense and the moment God explains anything. It's the diagnosis before the outcome, the prayer that hasn't been answered yet, the promise that looked so certain once and now looks like it might cost the very thing that made it feel real. Abraham isn't a symbol in that stretch of the story. He's just a man walking, because walking is the only thing left to do. And what the mountain pattern quietly insists, from Eden to Revelation, is that the walk was never wasted distance. It was the road to a meeting place that hadn't opened yet, not because God was absent during the climb, but because the climb was where the relationship was actually being formed, not the summit, the ascent. Which means the waiting many of us are living inside right now, the unresolved diagnosis, the unanswered prayer, the promise that hasn't caught up to the pain yet, isn't necessarily the absence of the mountain. It might be the walk toward it. Scripture never promises the ascent will be short. It promises, again and again, across 100 different centuries, that the mountain is where God meets the people who keep climbing. Every mountain in Scripture asks the same question Abraham had to answer 3 days before he ever reached the summit. Will you keep walking toward a place you cannot yet see the meaning of? If this changed the way you'll read these passages the next time you come across them, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe to the Scripture Project so you don't miss where we go next. And if someone in your life needs to see Scripture this way too, send this one to them.